So it's time to take a look at some more data mined cards. These are for the February season. They are all from Thanos's Black Order, his kind of gang of alien thugs like Ebony Maw. And I think some of these are potentially going to be pretty good. So we're going to talk through all these. I'm going to rank them from best to worst, saving my star ratings for their final official reveals, because sometimes these data mined versions do change before they hit the live game, but usually give us a pretty good idea for how these cards are going to look and how they're going to work. So that said, let's kick things off here with Black Swan. So this will be the season pass card. She's a 2/3 with a pretty nifty effect here. On reveal, until the end of your next turn, your 1-cost cards cost 0. And I gotta say, in card games, anytime something costs 0, you need to pay attention. That usually means you can do crazy stuff. You can cheese it. You can tend to break the game in one way or another with 0-cost cards. And I think there is some pretty big potential here with Black Swan. So because this lasts until the end of your next turn, this basically allows you to kind of front load this discount. For instance, you could play Black Swan on turn 5 and then go into turn 6 with all of your 1-cost cards for free. So if you had, 3, 4, 5 1-cost cards in hand, this could help you cheat effectively a bunch of energy. I mean, theoretically, you could have 7 1-cost cards in hand. I think that's a little unlikely. 3 to 4 is probably a more realistic goal to achieve. And you can dump those all at once, which can be great to do things like dodge priorities, so you don't have to worry about a Killmonger. If you've kind of saved all of your power dump until the final turn, you're good to go. That means you can also weave in a support card alongside them, something like a Blue Marvel or a Kazar. Traditionally, you'd have to kind of play those ahead of time. Now you can potentially play those late and surprise your opponent with a really big power dump from all those ones and that supporting buff card as well. On top of that, I think something like a Hit Monkey actually makes a lot of sense. Hit Monkey with 0-cost cards is a magical combination, and you could really play a ton of stuff all on that final turn. Hit Monkey at 3, still weave a Mysterio in for 2. Normally that would only leave you 1 energy for all of those 1-cost plays, so you kind of have to work around that with 0-cost stuff in Hit Monkey decks. But now you could actually just run 1-cost cards and still dump a bunch of power alongside that Hit Monkey for this crazy turn 6 pop off. And where historically, a card like Kazar or Blue Marvel maybe didn't fit all that well into a Hit Monkey deck, now perhaps you could play a Kazar on turn 4, your Black Swan on turn 5, and have a Hit Monkey that's supported by all of these cheap 1-costs, now free, and still get those buffs from something like Kazar as well. Whereas before, that didn't always make sense because you couldn't always weave enough 1-costs into that Hit Monkey turn to really make it worth it. So basically some kind of like zoo, miracle hybrid of sorts makes a lot of sense for me with this card. Whereas before you had to have sometimes some bounce stuff to make all that work with Beast to get those discounted 1-cost back in hand. Now it requires a little bit less setup, and you can just play more honestly for tempo through that early to mid game, play for those buffs, and then still finish strong. Another option for this card, I think, is actually in Thanos stacks. Of course, with stones in Thanos stacks, being able to play those really affordably can just help you get a lot of stuff done. You could play this like on turn 4 and play, Professor X with multiple Infinity Stones to really make sure you lock down that lane with Professor X, or just kind of stay on curve. Or perhaps on turn 6, if you set this up, you could play Thanos and Infinity Stones at the same time, because normally that 6-cost Thanos precludes you from playing any 1-cost stuff. But now that your 1-cost stuff is 0, slam that Thanos, slam the Power Stone, maybe a couple other stones to surprise the opponent, and boom, you've dumped 20 power out of nowhere perhaps that they're not expecting. So pretty nice support perhaps in the early game just to kind of push some tempo and save some energy, or in the late game for those big power surprises as well. So yeah, those are a couple examples of how I'm seeing this card could be used. I'm sure there are going to be even more interesting ways to play with something like this though, because again, just saving energy is good, and surprises are good, both of which this card allows. 0-cost cards tend to do crazy things as well. So I think this one does have a lot of potential. It might be sort of narrow in its deck applications. This is clearly not a card every deck wants to run, not one of those general utility sort of cards that pops up all over the place, but does seem like a very specific and powerful enabler in certain builds. So moving on, let's take a look here at Cull Obsidian. This is a cool looking dude, a big old 410 that you can only play at a location with an Infinity Stone. Also ongoing, can't be destroyed. So he's gonna dodge Shang-Chi's. You don't have to worry about him getting removed by Shang-Chi, but you do have to worry about playing him in a Thanos deck because you have to have an Infinity Stone at that location first before you can play Cull Obsidian. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like Crossbones. You have to be ahead to play Crossbones. Well, now you have to have an Infinity Stone to play Cull Obsidian. So 99% of the time you're gonna have to run this in a Thanos deck. Of course, there are technically ways to play this otherwise. Stuff like Jubilee could summon it, Lockjaw could summon it, etc. But in most cases, I think you're only gonna want to run this in Thanos, which is sort of a big change for Marvel Snap. We haven't had any cards so far that have been that hard limited to a specific synergy. This is something we often call parasitic design in card games, which can be a pretty scary trend when they print cards that kind of only work within their own package. So I hope this isn't something we see too often. I mean, it's really cool from a flavor standpoint since all these dudes hang out with Thanos and stuff. But, you know, if this said you can only play this at a location with a 1-cost card, that would be sort of a more general use case that would still fit into that Thanos theme. But this is really restrictive, which is going to suck for people who get this but don't have Thanos. But anyway, that's a bigger conversation for another day. As far as the power level of this is concerned in a Thanos deck, yeah, I actually think it's pretty good, right? 10 power for 4 we know can feel very, very efficient, can feel quite good. Getting an Infinity Stone down early is all but guaranteed by turn 4. You know, it is sometimes going to be restrictive about where you can play this, but probably not too much. You're not going to feel like this 10 power has to go anywhere super specific necessarily. And frankly, you might already have multiple Infinity Stones down to give you plenty of choice anyway by that stage of the game. So yeah, this does look like a great threat in Thanos decks. Now, Thanos decks haven't really been playing like big 4-drops in the package, but that's just probably because they've had better access. They often actually also skip turn 4 and just try to play multiple 5-drops using Psylocke or the Ramp Stone, I guess the Green Stone. So they play like, you know, Professor X early, they play Vision early. That could still be in those decks, but, you know, having a good 4-drop to fall back on, I think makes a lot of sense. And, you know, this is just going to feel like such a good card. It would feel silly not to run it probably in Thanos decks. The real question then becomes, are Thanos decks going to be good enough to support this? Does this make Thanos decks good enough on its own? I think in combination with stuff like our previous card and some of these Thanos support cards, there will definitely be a Thanos deck that makes sense at this stage. And in that case, Cull Obsidian will definitely feel like a good inclusion in most of those lists. So I think this card actually will make sense. Just kind of strange from a design restriction standpoint for Marvel Snap so far. So moving on here, we've got Proxima Midnight, and I think this looks pretty dang good. It's a 4/6. When this is discarded, it jumps to your lowest power location that isn't full. So that effectively is going to make this a 0/6 in many cases, because of course, you know, a lot of discard decks are just going to run MODOK, and if this is going to end up in hand, MODOK is absolutely going to discard this, you know, often leaving behind maybe some swarms and an apocalypse, but also, you know, just dumping the 6 power. That kind of gives you that 14 power play on turn 5 that also spreads out your threats, which can make it really hard sometimes for the opponent to figure out where to play, or can create some really favorable breakpoints sometimes. So this might sound like a downside, like, oh, this is going to my lowest power location. You know, that might be wasted. That might be a location I'm not trying to win. But most decks, most of the time, are really kind of, you know, vying for all 3 locations at one stage or another, and then using that final turn to kind of take advantage in 2 of those. But you want to put a showing in all 3 locations, and just because it's your lowest power location doesn't mean you've given up on it either. It might be a location with 5 power from a Lady Sif, and then MODOK is on the far right at 8 power. Proxima goes to the Lady Sif location. That's 11 power. That's still a great contest. That might be enough to flip that into your favor while still developing a lot in a MODOK location as well, creating some really hard points for your opponent and a lot of friction for them to figure out where exactly they're going to play. You still got those big turn 6 threats sometimes, swarms, apocalypse, etc. Dracula is a little bit of a different conversation right now because of the change to America Chavez. I don't know if Dracula is going to make sense in discard decks as much, because you used to have that guaranteed backup of Chavez where you could always kind of rely on Dracula being at least a 4/9 if you weren't going to hit him off the Apocalypse. Now your top decks are a little weird. You can still have that Apocalypse in hand for the Dracula. Just things get a little messier. But anyway, often that Dracula kind of contests the location on his own, which means he's 0 power up until the end of the game, which does often mean Proxima Midnight would go into a Dracula location and kind of be wasted, because often that Dracula is going to be pretty big, especially if it's hitting that Apocalypse. So there is a little bit of funkiness there, potentially, with Proxima sometimes getting wasted, but I don't know how exactly discard decks are going to shape out post America Chavez. If Dracula is still a big part of that and still relevant, that could limit this card a little bit, but I could also see this moving in more of a tempo direction, just running a bunch of high statted discard stuff, the Lady Sifs, the Hell Cows, the Sword Masters, where they don't care about what they're discarding. It's more about blind discards and just hoping that you hit good payoffs and stacking the deck with payoffs. So you have the Dakin Shard, you have Proxima Midnight, you have Wolverine, you have X-23, and you're just happy to hit whatever, because you're just going to get a bunch of free power and a bunch of naturally highly statted discard cards to fuel all that. So there could be two different paths. The kind of traditional MODOK Apocalypse path we have right now could be more of a tempo discard path if this pays off. I think potentially it works really well in both. Ultimately, 6 power for free is just really, really good when you don't have to spend energy on this. And sometimes if you do have to spend energy on it because it's not lining up for a discard, or you just got 4 energy to float, it's not a disaster to play a 4/6. Not exciting, but not a disaster. We've seen plenty of Iron Lads that didn't hit anything that still felt like relevant plays. So I think this card actually has a pretty good floor and a really nice ceiling as well to support a various kind of discard lines. This one to me looks really good. So speaking of discard stuff, we got another card here to look at. Corvus Glaive. He is a new 3/4. On reveal, discard 2 cards from your hand to get +1 max energy. So this is a Hell Cow and an Electro that had a baby. And that's what it looks like. Electro, dude. I don't know. That's, I don't know. We're just going to leave that there. But yeah, that's exactly what this does. So it's going to work like Electro as a payoff. Instead of having the downside of playing 1 card per turn, your downside here, of course, is discarding 2 cards, which for decks running Electro would feel an awful lot like a downside right now. So Electro ramp decks probably wouldn't be too happy to discard 2 things, because those might be high value things. Big late game bombs and combo pieces. That could be a Black Panther, an Arnim Zola, and Odin, the sort of stuff they maybe wouldn't want to lose necessarily, because that's going to be how they win the late game. But of course, if you're playing this in a discard deck, that might not be a downside at all. It might be an upside, because you might just hit a Proxima Midnight and just get some crazy stat bonuses. You might hit a Wolverine and be really happy about it, right? There are ways to use this in a discard deck as a benefit and not a downside. And then of course you have a lot of extra energy. Now the question is, are you going to have stuff to cheat out with this max energy? In other words, what's the upside of this max energy in a discard deck? I think there are some pretty interesting lines you could do. Stuff like having, you know, a big Apocalypse, and then you like Arnim Zola the Apocalypse or something, you know, and then you get like 2, you know, 16 power Apocalypses or something off of an Arnim Zola. In other words, having a 6-drop into a 6-drop is often a reason to play a ramp card like this or Electro. Sometimes you just can't play 2 6s in a game otherwise. We see that with like Dr. Doom into Odin in Electro ramp decks. Now, that would be great again for Corvus Glaive, but if you discard your Odin, if you discard your Dr. Doom, you got problems. So I don't know if you can run this in a traditional ramp list. So are there like discard supporting packages basically that fit Corvus Glaive nicely? Like I said, there's maybe some ideas. It's exactly Apocalypse into Arnim Zola that I'm thinking of here. You could also use this sometimes to cheat out 5-drops. That's another reason we see ramp a lot, to cheat out a Professor X, to cheat out a Sandman early to limit your opponent. Again, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense in discard necessarily. There's stuff like MODOK you could try to cheat out, but it doesn't really feel like you need to do that necessarily. Changing the clock on discard decks as we see them today has not, in my mind, felt very useful. I don't see a lot of lines there. So unless I'm missing some specific combination where the ramp on this creates a really specific opportunity, I wonder if this is going to have some like fit problems or need problems, because just having 1 extra energy, that's fine and dandy. Like, yeah, of course, everybody loves extra energy. It can sometimes help fix your curve and such. But for discard as a package in particular, they've relied on a pretty specific curve and don't really have a lot of reasons to need that extra energy necessarily. So do you risk a card like this? You need to run it. Would you rather just have a Hell Cow? You know, would you rather just have a Swordmaster for a little bit of extra stats and a single discard if you're planning to play on curve anyway? So that's the question to answer for me on this one. Now, I love ramp cards. This discard can be a huge upside, so I don't want to write this off by any means. There's a lot of latent potential here. I just don't really see the finish or the need just yet, but I'm curious if you guys can think of specific combos or reasons to run this tied to discard. Of course, I can think of a lot of combos that love ramp, like a normal Electro ramp decks, or stuff like Null into Arnim Zola, right? Anytime you have 2 6-drops together, I can think of a lot of those examples, but I can't think of a lot of those examples that would survive having part of their combo discarded, which is what you have to risk with Corvus Glaive. And it does say to get +1 max energy, so I don't think you can like turn this off and still get the max energy. You know, you have to have the cards in hand and such to make it count. So I think I'm kind of rambling there, but in essence, a lot of potential with this card, but does seem at odds with itself a little bit right now. So our final card here is Supergiant, a new 1/2 with a pretty crazy effect on reveal. All cards played this turn and next turn don't reveal until the game ends. So this lives in a bit of an Invisible Woman space, but a couple important distinctions. Number one, this affects all locations. You don't have to play this. You don't have to play cards behind this like you would an Invisible Woman, so it gives you more flexibility. Number two, it also affects your opponent's cards. This does not say all friendly cards played this turn. So this card can really exist as a big disruption option as well as a kind of setup or combo enabler of sorts as well. For instance, any deck that needs to play things in sequence to set up future plays, Supergiant can really wreck them. The first example that came to mind for me was like MODOK. MODOK really needs to come down on turn 5 for discard decks to set up for their big turn 6s. Discount the Swarms, summon the Proxima Midnight now. Isolate that Apocalypse in hand for Dracula, assuming Chavez doesn't change the shape of that deck too much. But if you delay their MODOK until turn 6, you completely mess up their game plan because they need that discard to happen on turn 5. You've got stuff like Destroy decks. If you prevent them from destroying their Deadpool on any random turn on turn 3 or whatever, forget it, right? That Deadpool's stuck until the end of the game, or their destroy cards don't activate, thereby, you know, not discounting their death, and so on. It can really, you know, mess things up from an ordering and sequence standpoint. Basically, any kind of like discount card that you happen to catch. You play this on turn 1, your opponent's Zabu can't come down on turn 2, could completely throw off their curve basically as well. There are a lot of different decks that rely on specific sequencing where Supergiant could be a big disruption. Sometimes that'll be hard to time and predict well, depending on the deck. Other times it might feel more obvious, but that potential exists. Now, also, of course, on your side of things, you can use Supergiant as a combo enabler to hide your own things at key moments, and you can do them in a flexible way and in a way that's not easily countered. Right now with Invisible Woman, an Enchantress or Rogue can steal that effect of Invisible Woman, reveal those cards before you want. With Supergiant, if this on reveal goes off, they're gonna stay unrevealed because there's no way to counter this effect. It just happens. It's just there. So, you know, you could play like a turn 2 Supergiant into a turn 3 Mystique and bank that Mystique until the end of the game so that whatever big card you played on turn 6, like an Onslaught or something, Mystique could basically copy that Onslaught banked way ahead, just waiting until the end of the game to activate her effect. If you had some like energy cheat, you could play this and MODOK together on turn 5 or maybe turn 6 in a Magic Limbo game, and then play Hela on turn 6, making sure that MODOK Hela just works. Unlike Invisible Woman, of course, which can be pretty risky, setting up for that Cosmo of the opponent's side. Like, this is just going to go off because Supergiant makes it a far less risky proposition to hide those cards. There's also some interest with Alioth here in the newly changed version of Alioth. Alioth works on all cards played that are unrevealed. They don't have to be played this turn. So if you played Supergiant like with priority on turn 5 and you caught your opponent's turn 5 plays, and you also caught their turn 6 plays and they weren't revealed, then that Alioth will be able to come down and potentially wipe out both of those, assuming they're in that Alioth location. So some interest there. I don't know how good that'll be, but another possibility. So all in all, this card does do a lot of different things. it is one of those things where it's kind of sneaky, and often in Marvel Snap, we kind of prefer like consistency and output and proactive game plans. So does this do enough like for your own combo enablers to kind of make those more reliable and make those work enough to make them more meta than sort of straightforward power deposit decks, which are what we have a lot of today? Alternatively, is the disruption here consistent enough? Can you hit that often enough to make it worth it? For decks that maybe value both sides of that, I could definitely see this being a standout. I think there'll be plenty of other decks though that just don't think this one's worth it because they don't really benefit enough themselves, and maybe that disruption only matters a portion of the time. And in those cases, it gets cuts for something that just offers more to their specific game plan. So a pretty high utility card, a pretty sneaky card. I think some real potential in this one, just not absolutely crazy because a lot of decks probably decide they don't necessarily need it. All right, so all those discussions had, let's rank these cards from best to worst. My number 1 card is Black Swan. My number 2 card is Proxima Midnight. My number 3 card is Supergiant. My number 4 card is Cull Obsidian. My number 5 card is Corvus Glaive. And there you go. That wraps it up for this look at the latest datamined cards. I'm curious what your guys' rankings are for these. I think choose like kind of consistency over high rolliness in my rankings, but I'm curious if you see it the other way around. I think that's kind of true for Marvel Snap these days. A lot of the best decks are just kind of about like consistent power output and less about sneakiness, but that day might change in Marvel Snap eventually and might surprise us all. So curious to hear your take on these. Thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.